How did this happen? Why am I having to run around again for the food program? You might be thinking that the 2 editions we've already made on what to eat to run would have been enough, but then I came across a story I couldn't resist, one that involves a runner, and when I heard it, I knew straight away I wanted to share it with you. I have to say from the start that it's controversial. Some of you aren't going to like what you hear, but I promise at the very least it will make you think. And by the way, when I started out, I did think it was all going to be about runners and running, but the way things have turned out, it's actually about all of us, your health and mine, and involves one of the big nutrition questions of our times. Should we all be eating a low-fat diet or a low-carbohydrate one? Phew. Does that mean I can stop now, Claire?
No, I think we'll just do another lap dance, and maybe just a bit faster this time, and I'll keep recording.
Oh,
okay?
goodness me. Well, at least I hope you appreciate my commitment in making this programme. That's much better. A nice, warm studio. Well, first, let me introduce the person at the centre of this story.
My name is Tim Noakes, and I'm a retired professor, recently excommunicated from my university for telling the truth.
Before we hear what that truth is, some background. Professor Tim Noakes is one of the best-known scientists in South Africa, the author of more than 10 books and hundreds of research papers. And he became one of the most influential voices on the subject of sports performance and nutrition. All of this during a career spanning more than 3 decades.
I studied medicine, but realized I was never really cut out to be a medical doctor. I wanted to be a medical scientist. And so I went into research and teaching sports science in the 1980s. And immediately we got involved in studying carbohydrates because I was running marathons and ultramarathons, and we believed, or we had been told, I should say, that carbohydrates were essential. They were the critical factor that determined performance. So I wrote a book called The Law of Running, and it is full of how carbohydrates determine your performance. So this is what I did and studied for right up till 2010.
Tim, this is the sound of your book, 900 pages, over 15 chapters, and I've met people who describe this as the Bible of running. And in it, you explain that running performance is all down to eating carbohydrate, which led people around the world to carb load. That means feasting on big bowls of pasta before races. But now you say you've changed your mind.
What is much better for the vast majority of runners, like 99%, it's very probable that you can do just as well on a high-fat diet. And the beauty of that high-fat diet is you start running and you burn fat. You're immediately just burning the fat as you're meant to. That's how humans are designed. You don't need the carbohydrates.
But before you recently changed your mind and started to talk about low-carb, high-fat diets, why were you so convinced that carbs were the key to success?
That's a fabulous question. You see, in 1970, I was a second-year physiology student in Cape Town. And that was the year that the first studies came out in which they measured carbohydrate content of the muscles. And we call that muscle glycogen. It's the way you store sugar in your muscles. And a group of Scandinavians had developed a technique to measure glycogen. And they had shown, with very dubious studies, I might add, retrospectively, that the more carbohydrate you ate before running a marathon, the faster you ran, or before going into a laboratory for a test, the more glycogen you had in your muscles, the longer you could maintain that exercise. I mean, here I was, a second-year medical student, and these were the doyens of exercise science, and they were saying carbohydrates is everything. And at the very same time, a few years later, I went into cardiology research. That was what I did my PhD in. And my professors were then saying, you must eat no saturated fat. You must only eat cereals and grains. Who am I to question what my professors are telling me? This was all received wisdom. It was what my professors, the anointed, were telling me. Then I got into running, and what did we do? We got funded by the industry, the carbohydrate industry. So our research was dependent on finding things that made carbohydrates look good.
So for 30 years, Professor Tim Noakes was a pillar of the nutrition establishment. Fat was bad, carbs were good. And if you were a runner, success could only be found by applying that formula. And then, in his 60s, a strange thing happened. Well, in fact, two strange things happened. The first took place in the early hours of December the 12th, 2010. Tim Noakes heard a voice inside his head.
I woke up in the middle of the night and my brain said to me, you must get out and run tomorrow morning and you mustn't stop running for the rest of your life. And I don't know where it came from. And so I listened to that voice. So I got up the next morning and then I had this terrible run. And
Terrible run meaning what? How far did you run and how did it feel?
I have a little 5K run near my home and it ends up a hill, which is a tiny hill. And I've run these ultramarathons and I've run up really big mountains. And this is a tiny little hill and I reached the top and I thought it was the summit of Mount Everest. I felt so terrible. So I decided things have got to change. And I said to myself, but how can I change? Here I'm overweight. I eat the right diet. Whenever I've tried to lose weight, I've had to go starve myself and I can do it for a week and then it collapses.
It looked like Tim Noakes was having a bad day. And it appeared to get even worse when he logged onto his computer.
I opened my emails and there was an advert for a book, The New Atkins for a New You. And I was so angry that this is written by three people who are good scientists telling us we had to eat saturated fat, etc. And I said, what frauds these people are. And I thought, no, this is too impossible. I've got to go and read the book. So I rushed down to the local bookseller, bought the book and opened it expecting to be really angry with the non-science and everything and the pseudoscience. And after 2 hours, I said, oh my gosh, I got it wrong.
That diet bore no resemblance to the carb-fueled one Tim had advocated and eaten himself for more than 30 years. And so began a new low-carb, high-fat approach to life.
So I decided right there and then on December the 12th, 2010 to change my diet. And that was well over 7 years ago and my health just immediately improved.
Can you explain how big a difference you had made to what you were eating? What was in and what was out?
I just said I'm going to eat a carnivorous diet. I'm not going to eat any vegetables, any fruits, and particularly cereals and grains. They went out. I said, listen, I don't mind for a month or two not eating any vegetables because I know they've got carbohydrates in them. And I still didn't understand how much carbohydrates in anything. So I said, well, I'm just going to eat the foods that I know have no carbohydrate in them. So I went just on a carnivorous diet, which is the diet I was actually brought up on, you see. So it wasn't difficult for me. And so I ate lots of fish and chicken and meat and biltong, that's beef jerky in South Africa, and nuts. And I must tell you, within 6 weeks, my running had improved so dramatically. It had literally gone back 20 years. And I remember I have a mountain run, which I've been doing for 40 years now. And I had slowed down substantially. And on my 6th week, which was probably the 3rd time in those 6 weeks I ran the mountain run, I dropped my time by 40 minutes. And it's a 12K run. I could not believe it. I came down the mountain sprinting and shouting and screaming with joy that I'd rediscovered something that I'd lost 20 years before. It was amazing transition. It was just dramatic.
I know, it sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? But stay with me here. Remember, Tim Noakes had spent decades teaching and researching at a university level. He'd been at the top of his game, and so he'd become a rare thing, a respected scientist who announced to the world he'd been wrong all along and felt the need to say sorry. It's that dramatic shift that makes me find this story so fascinating.
When I realized that I got it completely wrong in 2010, I had a choice. I could say, well, actually, I'm not going to tell anyone. I'm just going to go and hide it. I'll change my diet, but I'm not going to tell anyone else. And I realized that I had to be truthful and that I had hurt people. That diet is hurting a majority of runners. And I say that without fear of doubt, that the majority of runners, if they're eating high carbohydrate diets, they're harming their health in the long term.
A take on nutrition that Tim Noakes became convinced applied not just to runners, but to all of us. But for such a complete shift in his scientific thinking, there would be a high price to pay.
I knew that there was going to be some controversy, but I didn't understand that it would be as bad as it was. It was tough. It was really tough. Worst times of my life.
What happened next and the consequences of Tim Noakes' rethink on food is documented in his most recent book, The Law of Nutrition. In it reads a section, "Once upon a time, long ago in another world, I was considered quite a good scientist. That was about to change, and Tim Noakes found himself in a situation in which he risked losing everything. His relationship with his university broke down, peers in the scientific world ridiculed him, dietitians attacked him, and eventually he was put on trial.
Everything I'd done for 33 years, and I was one of the best known South African scientists, everything I'd done would be completely wiped out. And I spoke to my wife and I said, we can't let this happen. Whatever it costs us, we have to fight this.
That fight was triggered by 21 words, a message sent to one of his followers on Twitter, a response to a question from a breastfeeding mother about low-carb, high-fat diets. It led to a high-profile trial brought by the Health Professions Council of South Africa and reported across the country.
Sports scientist Tim Noakes is sticking to his guns following a complaint by the Association for Dietitians in South Africa. The organisation laid a complaint against Noakes after he suggested on Twitter that a mother wean her baby with a low-carb, high-fat diet. The organisation has accused Noakes of unprofessional conduct.
I lost all my funding when I went this route. And the only person they couldn't isolate me from was my wife. And if they had isolated me from my wife, I was nothing. That would have been the end of my life. But fortunately, we're a very strong pair.
To convey by the use of the acronym LCHF, or
The
what
hearing
exactly
of the Healthcare Professions Committee took place last April.
And 25 days later in court, and a couple of million rands down, including 10 million rands cost to the Health Professional Council,
That's several hundreds of thousands of pounds.
I won my case because there never was a case.
This committee thus agrees
The
with the
legal
protocol
arguments
component
may have focused on the sharing of medical advice on social media, but much of the evidence and the science explored during the trial was about food, nutrition, and Tim Noakes' new stance on carbs. So what was the scientific thinking he now endorsed? For that, Tim Noakes explains, you need to reflect on our evolution as a species.
If you lived in Britain 10,000 years ago, it was under ice, so there wasn't too much vegetables and grains and cereals and strawberries and fruit that anyone was eating. What were they eating? They were eating mammoths and mastodons and so on. That's what we were eating 10,000, 30,000, 40,000 years ago. And the ice age spread right through most of North America and a large part of Europe. And we were eating high-fat diets at that time. And we were incredibly good at killing the biggest animals. We didn't choose small, tiny, weak animals. We hunted the strongest, the fattest animals because we had to get the fat to be healthy under those conditions. That's point one. The second point is that we evolved from primates who are what we call hindgut fermenters. And hindgut fermenters, like gorillas, eat roots and shoots, and they convert it in the hindgut through the action of anaerobic bacteria into saturated fat. What humans realized 2 to 3 million years ago was rather than carrying around this huge gut like the gorilla, why don't we eat the herbivores, because they've done the job of taking grass and making it into saturated fat. Why don't we eat the animals and then we'll get our saturated fat for free? And that's what we became. And we didn't eat much carbohydrate.
And the final piece of the jigsaw is the arrival of our modern Western diet.
All of a sudden, we convert the diet to becoming very high in carbohydrate, but we don't have the biology to sort out all that carbohydrate because it's absorbed directly into the bloodstream. It goes straight to the liver. We were never exposed to that over millennia. And there's an emergency response, and that is to secrete this hormone insulin. And insulin then drives the carbohydrate into our muscles and to our liver and makes sure that our muscles stop burning fat. And so they can only burn this carbohydrate to get rid of it. You have to get rid of it out of the bloodstream immediately.
Now, you might be thinking that all sounds a bit Atkins and paleo, but one argument Tim Noakes put forward during his evidence at his trial is that there's a longer history of this view of nutrition. One famous example came from England in the 1860s. I guess you should tell us who William Banting was. An obese undertaker to the royal family, I think?
That's correct. And he tried every diet possible, including buying a big rowing boat and rowing up and down the Thames for hours a day. And he said all it did was make him very muscular and very hungry, and he didn't lose one pound.
But that changed when Banting met a doctor called William Harvey, who put him on a low-carb, high-fat diet.
Harvey figured that carbohydrates had something to do with obesity. He didn't know why, but he guessed it and he lucked out. And Banting lost about 40 pounds over a period of 6 months because his diet actually wasn't all that carbohydrate restricted. He was still eating quite a lot of carbohydrate. So he lost the 40 pounds, and then he wrote a book called Letter on Corpulence, addressed to the general public, and it became a bestseller. It was picked up by a German doctor, Epstein, who then took that to Germany, and it became very popular, and it went to North America and formed the main diet for obesity in Sir William Osler's textbook of medicine. So if you read his 1892 version of Principles and Practices of Medicine, there you see Osler says the treatment of obesity is the Banting-Epstein diet.
What was Banting eating and drinking? What did Harvey say he could consume that would still enable him to lose weight?
Well, he said you must cut all farinaceous foods. That was the key. And he did allow him some wine. And Epstein took the diet to Germany and said it's the fat content of the diet that's causing the weight loss and the carbohydrate restriction. Mm-hmm. That's why the diet worked so well in Germany, because of the Epstein version, which was the high-fat, low-carbohydrate. Mm. And so that's what it was. And then that diet held sway until the end of the Second World War. And then, unfortunately, some Americans come along and start talking about calories in, calories out. You've got to count calories to lose weight. And everyone forgets that perhaps carbohydrates are a little bit different, and they're the main driver of obesity. And then we become obese as a consequence of that.
But at the same time, when people were monitoring running performance and who was getting the medals in various events, could that also have been interpreted as in favour of carbs?
Well, of course, that was the time when the Kenyans and the Ethiopians were beginning to dominate marathon running. And so what do they eat? They eat a diet which is 78% carbohydrate.
This is things like ugali, a porridge-like food.
Correct. And I mean, I've been to Kenya and I've seen that they eat meat once a week, and the rest is ugali. And it's an astonishingly poor diet in my view, but it's amazing that they run so well. And I get criticized to this very day. How can you possibly say carbohydrates don't make you run faster when the Kenyans and the Ethiopians...
And what's your answer?
The answer is that we don't know what the Kenyans would do if they had a different diet. That's what we don't know. And it may well be that there are populations that are highly carbohydrate tolerant and they can eat high carbohydrate diets.
But Tim, there are many other respected scientists working in the field of nutrition saying you've lost the plot and describing you as an irrational evangelist for the low-carb, high-fat cause.
That's postmodernism. You have to understand postmodern arguments are they buttonhole you as something. So they will put you, you're this or anti that, and so that we don't have to listen to you because you're a moral deviant. They don't attack the science. They say Noakes is an evangelical, and therefore don't listen to him. It's power politics. And unfortunately at the moment, the power lies with the lobby industry. It doesn't lie with us. It doesn't lie with the people. And the people are getting ill. And they will continue to get ill until they ask the questions that I asked myself. I've been eating this diet religiously for 33 years and I've developed type 2 diabetes. My father died of type 2 diabetes. It is a disease you do not want. You do not want to die from it. It is a debilitating disease. It's a humiliating disease. I watched my father die for that disease over 4 years and couldn't help him because I didn't understand it. He had diabetes for 10 years and landed up with, he could not speak. He'd lost both his limbs. I've had diabetes for at least 7 years, probably more like 10 years. I should be in the same condition as him, but I'm not. Why not? Because I, thank goodness, changed my diet at the right moment.
Professor Tim Noakes. So what to make of this approach? Well, firstly, let's hear a view from the sports science camp and someone who's been thinking carefully about food and running.
In the blend, I've already put in 50 grams of oats, got 125 grams of dates. I'm now going to add 75 grams of almonds.
In her kitchen, sports nutritionist Anita Bean is making homemade energy bars from a recipe she developed for her recently published Runner's Cookbook. Based on her understanding of the latest science and with its own interesting take on carbs, she's also been monitoring the Tim Noakes trial.
He certainly rocked the boat. He certainly caused a lot of controversy. But that's not to say that Tim's approach is necessarily wrong.
Anita Bean's Runner's Cookbook touches on a relatively new technique in which runners can adapt their bodies to depend less on burning carbs and increase their dependence on burning fat, which can involve training sometimes with carbohydrate, sometimes without.
So, for example, you can, by training low carbohydrate, you can increase the number of mitochondria. That's the powerhouses in your cells that break down food into energy. So that's the kind of adaptation that you would get on a low carbohydrate diet. The only snag is that that doesn't support high intensity running. Then you will need some carbohydrates. So we're talking about sweet potatoes, we're talking about whole grains, we're talking about oats, and we're talking about pulses like beans and lentils. You're getting not just the carbohydrate, but also the fibre, and you're getting vitamins, you're getting minerals. So it's really better to get a whole package of nutrients.
Anita Bean.
When it comes to our health, it seems everyone has an opinion.
Well, let's now hear from someone very close to the medical world,
Hi, my name is Dr. Michael Mosley.
who, as you probably know, is the presenter of the BBC series Trust Me, I'm a Doctor. Before we go on to your thoughts on the Tim Noakes story, Michael, would I be right in saying that our relationship with fats and carbohydrates is very much under scrutiny right now?
Yes, no, I mean, I think once upon a time, and indeed it is still standard advice, the idea was and is, if you go to things like the NHS Choices website, that you should limit the amount of fat you consume to less than 30% of your diet, and around 50+% should be made up of starchy carbohydrates, things like bread and cereal and potatoes and things like that, with the rest consisting of protein and some fibre, though fibre is itself a carbohydrate. And obviously there is another group who are the low-carbers, who would argue that you should be cutting back severely on your carbs, reducing them to less than 30%. And that means you've got to be eating something. You don't really want to be pumping up your protein levels because high levels of protein are not terribly good for you. So for them, they would go for 50, maybe 60% fat in their diet. And these are two very different points of view.
And is it possible to say which way recent science is leaning?
It's really interesting and really complicated at the moment. There was a study which came out just this week, which was a study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, where they followed a large group of people who were randomly allocated to either a low-carb diet or a low-fat diet and then followed for a year. And what they found is that both groups lost a substantial amount of weight, around 6 kilos, but it was pretty much the same for both groups. Although within the groups, there were some individuals who lost enormous amounts, whereas others lost almost nothing. So that was, a draw, if you like, in the argument between the low-fatters and the low-carbers.
But there is another study, I think, that shaped your own approach to eating and fat and carb consumption. What was that study?
This is one of the best studies, as far as I know, nutrition studies ever done. And it was funded by the Spanish government. And in this particular study, they took over 7,000 overweight Spaniards and they randomly allocated them to either a low-fat diet or what they described as a Mediterranean diet. Now, it's very interesting when you look at what they meant by that, because it was quite high fat. But in terms of its effectiveness at reducing your risk of disease, it was very impressive. People on that diet they were still eating plenty of carbs, but in the forms of legumes. So I think that I am in the Mediterranean diet camp rather than in either the low-fat or the low-carb camp, because I think that's where the science sits most strongly at the moment.
So what do you make of the case unfolding in South Africa involving Tim Noakes and the strong stance he's now taking in favour of low-carb, high-fat diets?
No, I mean, really interesting, and I know he's got into some fairly hot water about it. I mean, what it's about, in a way, is two very different visions of weight loss and indeed how your body deals with food. On the one hand, you have the traditional view, which is that the way that you put on weight or lose weight is it's all about the calories. Calories in, calories out, and it really doesn't matter what the calories are. And then there is another point of view, which essentially says, look, we're not machines, that we have hunger which drives us, and we have complicated hormones going on. And that's really the camp he's in, and that says that insulin is the really important hormone here, that if you eat foods which have a very high glycemic index, that means they're rapidly absorbed, sugar and pasta and things like that. And I have to say I have a lot of sympathy with that point of view. It's complicated and really interesting. And the people who take the two opposing points of view tend to take them very vehemently and are kind of battling to the death about it at the moment.
And I'm telling this story in the context of running, and one inconvenient truth for Tim Noakes, which he acknowledges and says he can't explain, are the Kenyan runners who have a high carbohydrate diet and they eat lots of ugali, which is like a porridge. Could it be the case that we are moving rapidly towards a scenario in which we are all so different and different communities vary in the way that they break down foods and process them?
I have no doubt about it. Whether it is specific to any group or not, I don't know. But there's been some really interesting work done in Israel where they fed 1,000 people some standardized meals over the course of a week, and they also measured their blood glucose throughout. And what they found is that two people would respond completely different. So you could have bread and that would send your blood sugar levels soaring. I could have bread and it would have no effect at all. And say with grapes or something like that. So it turns out we are hugely individual, and the Israelis think it's actually down to your gut biome, that the mixture of gut bacteria you have is what actually determines your blood sugar response and therefore your insulin response. So I think this is fantastically interesting territory, but it also does make you realize that offering sort of generic advice is probably not that helpful. I mean, one of the things that I'm a bit skeptical when it comes to the so-called paleo diet is trying to guess what our ancestors ate, because our ancestors almost certainly did not. The remote ancestors live on loads of meat. I'm sure they were grubbing up every sort of thing they could get their hands on. And there are plenty of populations around the world who live on very high-carb diets, other populations who live on very low-carb diets, and yet who seem to be healthy on those diets.
Finally, Michael, are you a runner or ever been a runner?
No, I do it reluctantly.
And therefore you do not face the dilemma of whether to carb load or not ahead of a marathon?
Fortunately, I do not.
Dr. Michael Mosley. This week, the Health Professions Council of South Africa appealed its own committee's decision of the not guilty verdict against Tim Noakes. The professor is back on trial and fighting for his reputation and livelihood. As he said at the beginning of this programme, he's convinced he's right. A conviction that's changed his life, his diet, and his breakfast.
My breakfast was 4 eggs and bacon and avocado. That's what I ate after my workouts. And I can't think of a better meal than that. The 3 most nutrient-dense foods on the planet are eggs, sardines, and liver. So that's what you eat. I should maybe add some sardines and maybe some liver, but that's it.
And if sardines and liver aren't your thing, if you download the podcast version of this programme, we'll have a delicious guide to cooking for runners by nutritionist Anita Bean. A reaction to Tim Noakes' ideas from the running community, care of the editor of Runner's World, Andy Dixon, and some low-carb, high-fat running history from the author of Born to Run, Chris McDougall.